Blood stained the snow as Sigrid pressed the cloth against the unconscious man's wound. It was the same man who had killed her family that autumn. Now, fate had brought him wounded to her doorstep during the harshest blizzard of the winter. With trembling hands, she whispered, "Why do the gods test me like this? Letting him die would be so easy." Thank you for joining this story. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every subscription means the world. It helps keep this project alive as we strive to reach our first 1,000 followers. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and sharing where you're watching from in the comments. Your support truly makes a difference. The chill in the air bit deeper as the dawn struggled to breach the thick canopy of snow-laden pines. The forest lay silent, save for the weighty crunch of boots pressing into frozen earth hidden beneath the fresh blanket of white. Sigrid Thorvald's daughter moved slowly, each breath a misty ghost escaping into the frozen morning. 17 winters had sharpened her senses, but the solitude wrapped around her like a shroud, cold and unyielding. Her hands, toughened by months of relentless toil, gripped the makeshift trap she carried, the simple wooden frame cradling a small, lifeless hare. Its soft fur was dusted with frost, and its limbs hung limp, a testament to the quiet efficiency Sigrid had learned in these woods. Her blue eyes, usually so steady and piercing, flickered with a weariness that no child of her age should bear. The pine forest stretched endlessly in every direction, massive trunks rising like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The world was muted. Sound seemed muffled by the thick frost and dense air. The scent of pine resin mixed with the crisp purity of frozen earth, and the occasional sharp tang of smoke from distant fires barely reached her ears. A soft wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint promise of the coming storm. Sigrid's breath came in short, visible clouds as she trudged along a path she knew well, a narrow track wound through the frozen underbrush, marked here and there by the worn footprints of deer or the faint impressions left by other hunters. Every step was a reminder of how far she had come since the autumn that had shattered her world. Her pale cheeks were flushed with cold, and the woolen cap pulled low over her forehead hid most of her tangled blonde hair, strands escaping to brush against the frostbitten skin of her neck. Her small frame was bundled tightly in a dark woolen tunic, its edges frayed from constant wear, layered over linen trousers tucked into soft boots wrapped with strips of rawhide. Over her shoulders hung the wolfskin cloak her father had given her, its coarse fur a silent comfort against the merciless cold. 3 days since the blizzard swallowed the valley whole. 3 days since the last rays of sun had vanished beneath the heavy clouds that promised endless winter. But before the storm, before the biting winds took hold, Sigrid's world had been one of grim routine, survival carved from the quiet wilderness. She paused for a moment, fingers numbed by the cold, and looked up through the lattice of bare branches. The sky was a steely gray, the sun a pale disk struggling to burn through the thick veil of clouds. The light was weak, casting long shadows that reached like dark fingers across the snow. The weight of isolation pressed down on her, heavier than the frozen which she carried. Her breath faltered as memories stirred beneath the surface. The laughter of her sister Astrid, 7 years old and full of mischief. The steady hands of her father Thorvald building boats along the riverbank. Her mother's gentle voice humming ancient songs as she worked the loom. Each memory was a shard of warmth she clung to, fragments of a life stolen by fire and blood. The forest floor crunched beneath her steps, the sound sharp in the quiet. Ahead, smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney of her cabin, the only sign that life persisted in this frozen wilderness. The small dwelling was nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines whose dark branches seemed to guard the fragile human presence against the encroaching cold. As Sigrid neared the cabin, the scent of burning wood mixed with the faint aroma of dried herbs hung from the rafters. The heavy wooden door was weather-beaten, its surface scarred from winters past. With a steady push of her shoulder, it swung open, revealing the warm glow of the hearth inside. The tiny room was sparse but carefully tended. A bed of straw lay tucked into one corner, cloaked in thick pelts that trapped what little heat the fire offered. Against the rough walls hung her father's weapons, a battered axe, a cracked shield, and a short sword, all relics of a life ended too soon. Nearby, a small altar rested on a wooden shelf, adorned with a silver brooch belonging to her mother and the iron Thor's hammer necklace her father had worn. On the floor, a small rag doll lay abandoned, the faded blue dress stained with dirt and the tiny face worn from years of handling. It was Astrid's, a silent reminder of the sister who had vanished alongside the rest of their family. Sigrid set the trap down gently, her fingers lingering on the soft fur of the hair. The hunger gnawed at her, but more pressing was the weight of loneliness that pressed on her chest. She knelt by the fire, rubbing her hands together, the warmth seeping slowly into her frozen skin. The cabin was her sanctuary and her prison. Built with her own hands after the massacre, it stood as a fragile barrier against the relentless winter outside. Here, time seemed to crawl, marked only by the rhythm of her simple tasks, preparing food, tending the fire, mending clothes and tools, and keeping watch against the threat of wolves or worse. Outside, the wind began to pick up, moaning through the cracks in the cabin walls. Sigrid rose, moving to the small window where frost traced intricate patterns across the glass. Beyond, the forest stretched endlessly, a white wilderness that swallowed sound and hope alike. Her mind drifted back to the day the Roxy warriors had descended upon her village like a storm of fire and steel. The clash of shields, the screams that echoed through the trees, the blood soaking the earth beneath her feet. She had hidden, trembling, as her family was torn from her, one by one, until only silence remained. That night, when the flames died and the invaders vanished as quickly as they had come, Sigrid had slipped into the forest with nothing but the clothes on her back and the wolfskin cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders. For weeks, she had wandered, driven by hunger and the fierce will to live. Her survival depended on tireless days spent tracking game, setting traps, and gathering what little the forest would yield. She learned to read the signs of the land, the subtle breaks in snow where a hare had hopped, the scratch marks of a squirrel on bark, the faint trails left by deer. Every lesson was etched into her bones, every cold night a testament to her stubbornness. The days blurred into each other, marked by the slow creep of winter's grasp. At times, the loneliness was unbearable, a hollow ache that settled deep within her chest. But she found solace in small rituals, lighting the fire at dawn, whispering words of thanks to the gods, tracing her fingers over the worn wood of her father's sword, feeling the steady pulse of memory beneath the cold metal. Sigrid sat back down near the fire, pulling the wolfskin cloak tighter around her shoulders. The flickering flames cast shadows that danced across the rough walls, illuminating the lines of fatigue etched into her young face. She closed her eyes, breathing in the smoky warmth, and let the quiet settle over her like a balm. The world outside was vast and merciless, but within these walls, she carved out a fragile existence. A life built on the bones of loss, shaped by the harsh lessons of survival. Yet beneath the surface, a flicker of something more endured, a stubborn ember of hope, a yearning for justice, and perhaps, in time, a chance for something beyond mere survival. As night approached, the wind's howl grew louder, rattling the wooden beams and stirring the ashes. Sigrid moved to the doorway, peering into the gathering gloom. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in silence. The storm would last for days, and with it came uncertainty. Her fingers brushed the hilt of her father's axe resting against the wall, a tangible link to the past, a weapon and a promise. She glanced back at the altar, where the silver brooch and Thor's hammer glinted. Her breath came in slow, steady puffs, mingling with the cold air. She fought the urge to collapse beneath the weight of exhaustion, the aching in her muscles that came from days without rest or proper food. Her fingers, stiff and cracked from the cold, clenched tightly around the wooden frame. The forest was a world apart, untouched by the cruelty of men, yet beneath its quiet beauty lay the harsh laws of survival. Sigrid had learned this truth too well. She had learned to read the language of the trees, the tracks of animals, the shifting clouds that foretold the coming storm. She knew that winter was not merely a season here. It was a relentless adversary, a thief of warmth and hope. As she reached the edge of a frozen stream, her gaze caught a faint movement, a flicker of shadow among the snow-laden branches. Her heart quickened. For a moment, she thought it might be a wolf, or worse, a band of raiders. But the figure was too small, too fragile. She moved closer, the snow crunching beneath her feet betraying her approach. There, half hidden beneath a fallen pine, lay a young man, his body curled in on itself, breath shallow and ragged. His clothes were torn, blood staining the white snow around him dark and ominous. His hair, matted and frosted, clung to his forehead, and his face, pale and drawn, was masked in shadow. Sigrid's pulse thundered in her ears. She recognized the colors, the deep crimson of the Roxy clan, and a surge of bitter memories rose like flame in her chest. This was Bjorn, the man who had ordered the destruction of her village, the one who had killed her family. Her first instinct was rage, sharp and burning. She reached for her knife, fingers trembling, the cold somehow forgotten in the fierce heat of hatred. Her breath hitched as she knelt beside him, pressing her hand against the wound on his side. The blood was dark, thick, seeping through the makeshift cloth she tore from her own tunic. "Why?" she whispered, voice barely audible above the wind. "Why have the gods brought you here, to my door?" Bjorn's eyes fluttered open, green-gray orbs filled with pain and confusion. His lips parted in a weak groan, barely more than a breath. For a moment, their gazes locked, one burning with the weight of loss, the other flickering with vulnerability. The silence between them stretched, heavy and impossible. Sigrid's hand shook violently as she held the bloodied cloth tighter. To let him die would be to surrender to the bitter justice she had craved for so long. But to save him, to tend to the man who had wrought so much suffering, it was a choice that tore at her very soul. Memories came flooding back, the laughter of her sister Astrid, the strong hands of her father Thorvald shaping wood by the river, the warmth of her mother's voice humming ancient hymns. Would those memories condemn her for sparing this man, or would they demand she rise above the hatred that threatened to consume her? Her breath caught as the wind outside howled, rattling the branches like the drums of war, and yet within her, a fragile ember of compassion flickered. She reached quietly for the supplies she had painstakingly gathered, bundles of dried herbs, a small pot of water heated over the dying embers of the fire back at the cabin. With careful hands, hands that had mended wounds before, on animals and herself, she began to cleanse the deep gash in Bjorn's side. His skin was pale and cold beneath her touch, the sharp scent of blood mingling with the earthy aroma of the herbs. He winced softly but made no sound as she pressed the poultice in place, wrapping the wound with strips of cloth torn from her own clothing. "Why do you help me?" Bjorn rasped, voice barely above a whisper, his gaze searching hers with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Sigrid swallowed hard. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they represented to each other: enemy and victim, survivor and destroyer. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice steady despite the turmoil that twisted inside. "Maybe because I am tired of death, tired of blood spilled in vain." Her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, a yearning for a truth that had been buried beneath layers of pain. For hours, she tended to him, sharing the warmth of her fire, the meager food she had managed to prepare. Bjorn's breathing grew steadier, his fever fading as the night deepened. In those quiet moments, the boundaries forged by hatred began to blur. At times, Bjorn's eyes would stare into the distance, haunted by memories of betrayal and loss. He spoke little, but when he did, his words cut through the silence like a blade. "They lied to me," he confessed one night, voice rough. "Haraldr's poison twisted my mind against your people." Sigrid listened, the knot in her chest loosening just enough to let the fragile thread of truth take hold. The man before her was no longer merely an enemy. He was another soul trapped in the cruel dance of power and treachery. Yet, fear lingered like a shadow. She knew the danger that came with harboring such a man. The Roxy would come searching, their wrath as fierce as the winter storm outside. To protect him would mean risking everything she had fought so hard to survive. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the heaviest snowdrifts. Every instinct screamed to cast him back into the unforgiving cold, to let justice be carried out by the gods alone. But the choice to save him, it was a defiance of fate itself. Her hands trembled as she wrapped his fingers with cloth, trying to warm them against frostbite. Bjorn's eyes met hers, vulnerability and an unspoken plea shining through. "Help me," he whispered, voice cracking. "If you do this, if you survive, then perhaps there is a chance for something more." Sigrid's heart wavered between the tides of fear and hope. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like lost souls trapped in frozen woods. But inside her small cabin, a fragile alliance had been forged, one born not of friendship or loyalty, but of shared suffering and the faintest glimmer of understanding. She sat back against the wall, clutching the wolfskin cloak tighter. The fire flickered low, shadows dancing across the rough timber. The man who had once been her worst enemy now depended on her mercy. And in that merciless winter, Sigrid made a choice, not of vengeance, but of survival and perhaps the first step toward a future neither of them could yet imagine. The night stretched long, filled with whispered prayers to the gods, pleas for guidance, for strength to face the trials yet to come. Outside, the storm raged on, but within, a fragile warmth endured, born of impossible mercy and the fierce stubbornness of the human heart. The cabin's wooden walls groaned under the weight of the storm outside, the wind howling like a restless spirit pressing against the fragile refuge. Inside, the fire was low, its orange glow casting flickering shadows that danced across the rough-hewn timbers. The scent of burning pine mingled with the faint, earthy aroma of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Sigrid worked silently, her breath shallow but steady, her fingers gentle and practiced as she tended to the wound on Bjorn's side. His skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones, the wound a cruel gash that seeped dark blood onto the rough linen cloth she had wrapped around it. His breathing was uneven, shallow, but there was life beneath the exhaustion. She had managed to drag him through the snow, through the merciless winter storm, to this fragile shelter. For now, that was enough. Sigrid moved carefully, setting down the wooden bowl of warm broth she had prepared, leaning close to brush a stray lock of his matted hair from his forehead. Her fingers trembled despite the layers of wool wrapped around her hands. The weight of what she was doing pressed heavily on her, tending the man who had ordered the death of her family, the man who had been her enemy. Bjorn's eyes fluttered weakly open, green-gray orbs clouded with pain and fever. His gaze found hers, and for a fragile moment, the space between them was charged with unspoken words. No hatred, no accusation, only the quiet desperation of two souls caught in the cold, bound together by fate. "Water," he whispered, voice rasping like dry leaves. Sigrid nodded, moving to a small wooden bucket near the hearth. She dipped a cloth into the warm water, wringing it carefully before bringing it to his lips. The rough fabric was cold against his cracked mouth, But he drank, swallowing slowly. She saw the faintest flicker of relief. Bjorn's eyes followed her movements, tracking each motion with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He said nothing, but the tension in his body seemed to ease just a fraction. His chest rose and fell more steadily, the firelight catching the faint moisture on his brow. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Sigrid busied herself with stacking more wood for the fire. Her back turned as she fought to contain the swirl of emotions rising inside her. Rage, pain, confusion, and beneath it all, a whisper of something she had not dared to feel before, compassion. She moved to the small kitchen corner, where a rough wooden table held a few simple utensils and a clay pot simmering gently over the coals. She ladled thick broth into a carved wooden bowl, the smell of root vegetables and salted meat promising warmth and nourishment. Carefully, she set the bowl near Bjorn's hand. He looked down at it uncertainly, then back up at her. His voice was a hoarse rasp, barely audible. "Thank you." The word was simple, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. Sigrid nodded, a tight knot forming in her chest. "You must eat. It will help you grow stronger." Bjorn's eyes lingered on hers, searching for something he could not name. The space between them shifted, a fragile truce born in shadows and whispered prayers. As he raised the bowl in trembling hands, Sigrid noticed a small bronze ring glinting on his finger, engraved with the symbol of a raven. It was worn, battered by time and battle, but the craftsmanship was fine, proof of a man who had once commanded respect. The fire crackled softly as he drank, the warmth spreading through him like a balm. For the first time since she had found him, Bjorn's features relaxed, the lines of pain softening. His eyes closed briefly, exhaustion claiming him once more. Sigrid sat beside him, her own body weary from the effort of dragging him through the snow and tending to his wounds. She pulled her cloak tighter, fingers brushing absently over the wolfskin that had been her father's gift. The weight of the past was heavy here, the bloodshed, the loss, the endless winter that had threatened to consume her. Yet, in this small, fragile moment, a fragile warmth flickered between them. Not friendship, not yet, but something less defined, a recognition of shared suffering. Her gaze drifted to the small altar on the shelf, a silver brooch shaped like a hawk, worn smooth by years of handling, and the iron Thor's hammer necklace that had hung around her father's neck. Beside them lay a small rag doll, its face worn and faded, the last remnant of her sister Astrid. Bjorn's eyes opened again, and he followed her gaze. "She was young," he said softly. "Your sister?" Sigrid nodded, voice barely a whisper. 7 winters. She loved the color blue. A silence settled once more, carrying the weight of memories too painful for words. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin, pressing against the thin walls as if trying to tear them apart. Inside, 2 souls sat side by side, bound by loss and the cold hand of fate. Bjorn shifted slightly, wincing as pain stabbed through his side. Sigrid reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his arm as she adjusted his cloak. The touch was tentative, cautious, an unspoken offering of care. "You saved my life," he murmured, eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "How can I repay you?" She looked away, heart pounding. "I do not want payment." Her voice was low, resolute. "I want truth. Justice." He nodded slowly, the weight of his burdens clear in the lines etched across his face. "Then we are bound to one path." Long minutes passed in quiet companionship. Sigrid broke the stillness first, her voice soft. "Why did you attack us? Why destroy my home?" Bjorn's gaze darkened, shadowed by regret. "I was a pawn. Heralder." He whispered lies, planted false proof to turn me against your people. She frowned, anger flickering anew. "Heralder," she repeated, the name like venom on her tongue. "He took your place?" A bitter smile twisted his lips. "Yes, and now he hunts me." The weight of that confession settled heavily in the room. The enemy within their own ranks was more dangerous than any outside threat. Sigrid's mind raced. She had lived through the silence of death, the cold embrace of loneliness. But this betrayal was a wound that cut deeper than any sword. Her fingers brushed over the broken shield resting in the corner, a relic of her father's battles. If Haraldr had betrayed Bjorn, then their anger was not truly enemies, but victims of the same treachery. Bjorn's breathing grew labored again, the chill seeping into his bones despite the fire. Sigrid pulled a heavy blanket from a hook and draped it over his shoulders, covering the crimson cloak. The gesture was simple, but it spoke of a fragile trust growing between them. Hours slipped by like shadows, the storm outside relentless and unforgiving. Sigrid moved quietly, tending the fire, fetching water, and preparing more broth. Each act was a ritual of care, a defiance of hatred. At one point, Bjorn's eyes fluttered open, and he reached out with a trembling hand to grasp hers. The touch was brief, but electric, a silent promise that their fates were now intertwined. "Tell me about your village," he said, voice weak but steady. Sigrid hesitated, then began to speak of the river, the fishing nets, the long summer days filled with song. She spoke of her family, the laughter of her sister, the steady strength of her father. Her voice wavered as she recounted the day the warriors came. Bjorn listened in silence, the guilt etched deeper into his face with each word. When she finished, a heavy silence followed. The fire sputtered, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like fingers reaching for the past. Sigrid's gaze met his once more. "We were not enemies. We were victims." Bjorn nodded, the first glimmer of understanding breaking through the cold armor of grief. Outside, the storm began to ease, the howling wind giving way to a fragile stillness. Inside the cabin, two souls found warmth, not in fire or shelter, but in the fragile beginnings of trust. The long, harsh winter was far from over, and greater trials awaited them. But for this moment, in the flickering light and quiet embrace of the night, Sigrid and Bjorn dared to believe that even in the deepest cold, mercy could grow. And so, the cabin became more than a refuge. It was the cradle of a fragile hope, a sanctuary where broken hearts might one day mend, and where the seeds of a new beginning could take root amidst the frozen earth. The news traveled like wildfire through the frozen valleys and dense forests beyond the mountains. Whispers in dimly lit halls, hurried exchanges by travelers at crossroads, the cautious glances of hunters returning from their treks, all carried the tale of Bjorn Roxie's disappearance after the failed assault on the village and the peculiar silence that followed. None could fathom that the man who had once commanded terror now slept beneath the shelter of a young woman's roof, his worst enemy, no less. Sigrid felt it first in the uneasy stillness that pressed against the fragile walls of her cabin. The forest, once her sanctuary, now seemed a maze of watchful eyes and bated breaths. The wind carried voices that weren't carried by the storm, distant but unmistakably human. The crunch of footsteps in the snow, the low murmur of voices speaking in tones she had not heard since the autumn massacre. Each day, the questions grew more insistent in her mind. How long before they discovered the truth? How long before the hunters, trackers, or worse, the Roxy warriors, came searching for their lost leader? The weight of the secret pressed upon her heart like the heaviest of snows, threatening to crush the fragile resolve she had built. One morning, as the pale sun struggled to rise above the horizon, a sharp rap at the door shattered the stillness. Sigrid's hand instinctively moved to the axe resting nearby. Her breath caught in her throat as she cautiously opened the door to reveal a man whose face was unfamiliar yet tinged with an air of authority. His fur-lined cloak bore the insignia of a nearby settlement, a mark she recognized from distant trade routes and whispered tales. "I am Eirik of the Skjolder clan," he said, voice steady but laced with suspicion. "I come seeking news of Bjorn Roxy." Word has spread of his absence. Some say he fell to the winter's cold, days folded into nights as the fragile secrecy unraveled. Troops of hunters and scouts moved like shadows through the trees, their presence a constant reminder that the past would not be left buried beneath the snow. Traders and messengers brought scraps of news, their faces drawn tight with unease. The valley had become a powder keg, poised to ignite. Within the cabin, Bjorn's strength returned slowly, each breath a battle against the chill that seeped into his bones. Yet with health came clarity, and a growing realization of the peril that now encircled them both. "We cannot hide forever," Bjorn said one evening, voice rough but resolute. "Haraldr's men will come, and they will bring fire and steel." Sigrid met his gaze, the flicker of fear masked beneath her resolve. "Then we prepare, not just to defend a man, but to protect what remains of a future." Together, they devised a plan born from necessity and tempered by trust. Sigrid reached out to distant kin and old allies, weaving fragile alliances that transcended past grudges. Bjorn, once a leader shrouded in wrath, now spoke with the measured calm of a man who had tasted betrayal and sought redemption. But even as they marshaled their strength, the shadows of the past crept ever closer. One bitter dawn, a group of Roxy warriors appeared at the edge of the clearing, a band led by a man unfamiliar to Sigrid but bearing the cold, calculating eyes she knew all too well, Haraldr's lieutenant. The air grew taut with tension as the men dismounted, their weapons glinting in the weak light. The leader stepped forward, voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Bjorn Roxy," he called, eyes sharp and accusing. "Your betrayal has left our clan leaderless. We seek to restore order and claim what is rightfully ours. Surrender, or face the wrath of Roxy." Sigrid stepped beside Bjorn, her grip firm on the shattered shield that had once belonged to her father. "He is no longer your leader," she said, voice steady but edged with steel. "And you will find no easy victory here." The moment stretched, a fragile balance between violence and reason. The warriors hesitated, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Loyalties, once assumed, now wavered in the cold light of truth. From the tree-line, whispers spread among the watchers. Some stepped forward, voices raised in support of the man they had once followed. Others clutched their weapons tighter, eyes burning with the hunger for revenge. The battle was not of swords and shields alone, but of wills and words, of pleas and accusations laid bare beneath the pale winter sky. As tension mounted, Sigrid found herself torn between the desire to protect the vulnerable and the knowledge that standing firm might invite destruction. The community watched, waiting for a leader to emerge from the storm of conflict, a beacon of hope or a herald of doom. Through the long hours that followed, alliances shifted like the snowdrifts outside. Some came with offers of peace. Others whispered threats that chilled the blood. Sigrid and Bjorn faced a world that refused to forgive easily, where the past could not be erased and the future demanded sacrifice. In the quiet moments between confrontations, Sigrid felt the weight of her choices. To protect a man who had once been her greatest enemy was to risk everything she had fought to survive. Yet to turn away was to surrender to the endless cycle of hatred and violence. Her blue eyes, sharp despite exhaustion, scanned the faces gathered around, some hostile, others uncertain, all searching for a reason to believe in a different path. And in that frozen valley, beneath the shadow of war and betrayal, a fragile truth took root, that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in the sword, but in the courage to choose mercy when all odds demand vengeance. The world outside had discovered their secret. The question now was whether it would ignite another storm, or kindle the faintest light of hope amid the endless winter. The morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky a low, oppressive ceiling pressing down on the valley. Snowflakes drifted lazily from swollen clouds, The world wrapped once more in the cold silence of winter's grip. The quiet was a fragile veil, shattered abruptly by the distant clatter of hooves and the harsh voices of armed men breaking through the forest's edge. Sigrid stood beside the cabin's narrow window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the figures approach. The Roxy warriors had come, their numbers swelling behind the leader who rode at the front with a steely gleam in his eyes. Haraldr's lieutenant, a man with a cruel jaw and cold, calculating gaze, led this force, his blue-tinged cloak brushing the snow as he dismounted with deliberate grace. The air inside the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Bjorn, still pale and weakened but standing taller than before, gripped the worn hilt of his sword, the weight of the past weeks settling like iron in his chest. Sigrid's fingers closed firmly around her father's broken shield, fragments of worn leather and cracked wood pressing into her palm, grounding her in the storm ahead. "They found us," Bjorn said quietly, voice hoarse but steady. "They seek to finish what they started." Sigrid nodded, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. "We stand together, not just for you, but for all who believe the truth." Outside, the warriors formed a rough circle around the clearing, dismounting with practiced ease. Their armor clinked softly beneath heavy furs, eyes scanning the small homestead with suspicion and hostility. The frost on their breath curled like spectral smoke, and their weapons gleamed dully in the weak light, promises of violence hanging thick in the air. The lieutenant stepped forward, his voice ringing out, sharp and commanding. "Bjorn Roxy, you have betrayed your blood, your clan, and your honor. The Roxy demand justice. Surrender yourself, or face the consequences." Sigrid met his gaze without flinching, the fury that had long simmered beneath her calm rising like wildfire. "He is no longer your leader, and this is no longer your war." A murmur rippled through the warriors, some hesitating, others scowling. The lieutenant's eyes flickered, sensing the wavering loyalties, but he masked it with a cruel smile. "And who are you to defy the Roxy? A girl who hides a traitor beneath her roof." Sigrid stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering despite the pounding of her heart. "I am the daughter of Thorvald, the boat builder. This land is my home, and I will not let it be stained anew with blood spilled in lies and deceit." The warriors exchanged glances, the cold wind carrying the weight of ancient grudges and bitter memories. Sigrid's blue eyes locked with Bjorn's, drawing strength from the man who had once been her enemy but was now her ally. From the shadows of the surrounding trees, figures emerged, men and women from distant clans and scattered settlements who had come to witness this reckoning. Some bore weapons, others carried simple tools, but all stood with a quiet determination that spoke louder than swords. The fragile alliances Sigrid had woven through whispered promises and shared hardships now took shape in flesh and blood. Haraldr's lieutenant scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn. "Your petty alliances will not save you. The Roxy demand order, and order will be restored, with fire and steel if necessary." Bjorn raised his voice, shaking off the lingering weakness. "Order built on treachery is a lie. Haraldr, the true traitor, sits in the shadows while he warps our fate." A hush fell over the crowd. The name hung heavy, a secret finally brought into the light. The lieutenant's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His eyes darted between Bjorn and Sigrid as the weight of the accusation settled. Sigrid stepped forward once more, her voice rising with conviction. "We have suffered enough. Our families torn apart, our homes burned, all for the ambitions of one man. Haraldr's lies have driven a wedge between us. But today, we choose a different path." The warriors shifted uneasily. Some gripped their weapons tighter, others exchanged uncertain glances. Loyalties, once assumed inviolable, now fractured beneath the truth. From the edge of the clearing, a grizzled elder of the Roxy clan pushed through the crowd. His face was lined with age and sorrow, eyes clouded but sharp. If what you say is true, then justice must be served, not by war, but by reckoning. The lieutenant's posture stiffened. Voices rose above the din of those calling for calm, for reason. The elder Roxy stepped between the combatants, his staff raised. Enough. We will not spill the blood of kin without hearing the truth. Slowly, the fighting ceased, grudgingly replaced by wary silence. Sigrid's breath came in ragged gasps, sweat mingling with the chill upon her brow. Around her, the exhausted warriors lowered their weapons, eyes wary but watchful. Bjorn turned to the crowd, voice steady despite the pain etched into his features. Let us speak, and let the gods judge. The council convened beneath the skeletal branches of the ancient pines, the cold biting through furs and armor alike. Men and women gathered, their faces etched with fatigue, grief, and cautious hope. Haraldr's lieutenant was bound, his hands tied with rough cord, his expression a mask of simmering rage. One by one, witnesses spoke, the traitors who had seen the forged tokens planted among the slain, the warriors who had witnessed the whispered conspiracies, even some of Haraldr's own men who had turned away in disbelief. The truth unfolded like a bleak tapestry, revealing the depth of deceit that had poisoned the clan from within. Haraldr's betrayal was laid bare. The stolen cattle, the false evidence, the whispered lies that had shattered peace and ignited war. The crowd listened, the weight of betrayal sinking deep into their hearts. When the last word was spoken, silence settled over the clearing, thick and suffocating. The elder Roxy rose, his voice carrying the authority of generations. Haraldr has betrayed not only his clan, but the very laws that bind us. His treachery has cost lives and fractured families. Justice must be done. The lieutenant's face twisted with fury. You condemn me? I acted for power, yes, but for order. Without me, the Roxy will fall into chaos. Bjorn stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. True order comes from truth and honor, not from lies and bloodshed. The elder nodded solemnly. Haraldr will be stripped of his rank, cast from the clan. His lands and holdings will be divided among those who seek peace. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. The harsh sentence was met not with cheers, but with a sober understanding of the cost. Sigrid felt the weight of the moment settle upon her like the first thawing snow. The battle was won, but the scars remained, etched into the land, the people, and their hearts. As the council dispersed, Bjorn approached her, his strength waning but his spirit unbroken. You gave me a chance when none was offered. You saved more than my life. You saved the soul of our clan. Sigrid met his gaze, the memories of loss and pain still vivid beneath the surface. We survived the winter alone. Now, we must survive what comes next, together. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, the pale light of early spring bleeding through the clouds. The valley, battered and broken, held the faintest promise of renewal. Together, they stood at the threshold of a new beginning, one forged not in vengeance, but in the hard-won wisdom that even in the coldest winters, compassion could spark the fire of hope. The air inside the cabin was heavy with exhaustion and the lingering tension of the battle that had just passed. Sigrid's hands trembled as she tended the fresh wounds on her own arms, the stinging cuts and bruises a harsh reminder of the price paid for standing firm. Beside her, Bjorn leaned against the rough timber wall, his breath steady but shallow, the weight of his injuries pressing down like the unforgiving winter air outside. For a long moment, silence settled between them, neither daring to break it, as if words might shatter the fragile peace carved from chaos. Outside, the wind whispered through the dense pines, the first faint notes of spring barely daring to reach the frozen valley. Bjorn's gaze drifted toward the broken shield resting on the floor, the remnants of his daughter's father's protection, shattered yet unyielding. He shifted, wincing as pain shot through his side, and Sigrid immediately moved to support him, steadying his trembling frame. "You saved my life twice," he said quietly, his voice rough and low. "You stood against men who would have seen us both dead. I owe you more than words can hold." Sigrid looked away, the flicker of pain and relief mingling in her eyes. "It was never about debt," she replied softly. "It was about what truth demands. About choosing to live beyond the hatred." Bjorn nodded slowly, the green-gray of his eyes reflecting a hard-earned humility. "I was blind, led by ambition, by lies planted deep in the shadows. Haraldr poisoned everything, my mind, my clan, my honor." Her fingers brushed against the worn fabric of the wolfskin cloak she still wore, the gift from her father, both a shield against the cold and a symbol of the life she had lost. "The past cannot be undone," she said, voice steady but heavy with sorrow. "But we can choose what comes after." Outside the cabin, the remaining Roxy warriors gathered with the allies from nearby clans. Their faces were etched with fatigue, their eyes reflecting the storm of emotions that had torn through the valley. Anger, relief, suspicion, but beneath it all, a tentative hope. The elder Roxy, whose voice had carried the weight of justice at the council, approached the small gathering with a measured step. His weathered hands held a carved wooden staff, its surface worn smooth by years of solemn duty. "Today, we stand not just as warriors, but as survivors," he said, voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "The blood spilled here is a reminder of the cost of betrayal, but also of the strength found in truth." Murmurs of assent rose softly, the air thawing with the fragile warmth of reconciliation. Sigrid caught Bjorn's eye, their shared acknowledgement a silent pact forged not in hatred, but in the ink of hard-won understanding. As the warriors began to tend their own wounds and rebuild their scattered camp, Bjorn turned back to Sigrid, his expression solemn but touched by gratitude. "You have given this clan a chance to heal," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Not as a conqueror, but as a daughter of the land." She swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep within her chest. "I never sought to lead," she whispered. "But if this is the path before me, then I will walk it, with honesty and strength." The days that followed were a slow dance of rebuilding. The valley, once scarred by fire and blood, began to show signs of life beneath the melting snow. Hands once raised in battle now labored side by side, cutting timber, repairing roofs, mending fishing nets. The air was tinged with the scent of fresh earth and pine resin, mingling with the faint smoke of hearth fires rekindled. Children, once silenced by fear, cautiously emerged from the shadows, their laughter tentative but genuine. Women gathered by the streams, sharing stories and weaving cloth, their voices a soft chorus that filled the cold air with warmth. Sigrid moved among them, her presence a quiet force, her hands steady, her blue eyes watchful. At times, she caught Bjorn watching her from a distance, his expression a mix of admiration and something gentler, respect, perhaps, or the fragile beginnings of trust. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting the valley in a golden glow, Sigrid found herself standing beneath the ancient oak that marked the heart of the village. The ground was soft beneath her boots, the first shoots of green pushing through the thawing earth. In her hands, she held a young sapling, a slender oak shoot, its branches reaching skyward with hopeful determination. Nearby, a small crowd gathered, elders, warriors, and villagers alike. Their faces were worn by hardship, but their eyes held the spark of renewal. "This tree," Sigrid began, her voice carrying steady and clear, "will be the heart of our home. It is a symbol of life that grows from the ashes, of strength that endures even the harshest winters." She knelt, planting the sapling carefully into the earth. As she pressed the soil around its roots, a quiet stillness fell over the crowd, a moment of shared hope that transcended the years of pain. Bjorn stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. We have much to rebuild, not just homes, but the bonds between us, he said. With truth as our foundation, we can forge a future. As the night deepened, the hall grew quiet once more. Sigrid leaned back, her heart heavy but lighter than it had been for many moons. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges still unseen. Yet, in this moment, she felt the stirrings of something precious, the fragile bloom of hope. In the days and months that followed, the valley found its rhythm anew, marked not by the clash of steel, but by the steady pulse of life returned. Sigrid and Bjorn, once enemies bound by blood and betrayal, now stood as partners in a shared cause, their alliance a testament to the transformative power of compassion. The tale of the winter that nearly claimed them both became one of legend, a story passed from lips to eager ears around flickering fires. It was a story not of heroes clad in glory, but of ordinary souls choosing mercy in the face of hatred, of rebuilding where destruction once reigned. And in the heart of that frozen wilderness, beneath the spreading branches of the young oak, the people found a new beginning, proof that even the harshest winters yield to the warmth of forgiveness and the enduring strength of human connection. The first breath of spring stirred a subtle thaw across the valley, softening the edges of winter's relentless grip. Beneath the pale light of dawn, the snow receded like a retreating tide, revealing the earth's bare bones, dark soil rich with promise and tinged by the scent of pine needles and damp moss. The forest no longer whispered solely of survival, but began to hum with quiet renewal. In the heart of the valley, the fledgling village stood as a testament to resilience carved from pain. Simple wooden homes, freshly built from the sturdy pines that had once threatened to smother the land under their snow-laden branches, now rose like hopeful monuments against the muted sky. Smoke curled from chimneys, weaving through the crisp air, carrying with it the aroma of baking bread and simmering stew, a chorus of life reclaiming its rightful place. Sigrid moved among the villagers with a steady purpose, her figure silhouetted against the soft glow of morning. The wolfskin cloak hung heavier now, not just a shield against cold, but a mantle of responsibility she had come to bear with quiet dignity. Her hands, still marked by the calluses of survival, reached out to steady a child learning to wield a hammer, to guide an elder as they repaired a fractured beam, to clasp the hand of a weary hunter returning from the forest's edge. The bonds between people, once shattered like brittle ice, were healing, forged anew through shared grief and a collective will to rise. Where suspicion and fear had lingered like shadows, now flickered tentative trust. The scars of war had not vanished, but they no longer defined the valley's spirit. Bjorn, leaner but stronger, moved alongside her, his presence a quiet anchor. The lines of hardship etched into his face had softened, tempered by the slow balm of reconciliation. His familiar red mantle was now worn with less defiance and more humility, the armor of a leader reborn from the ashes of betrayal. Together, they walked the narrow paths between cabins, greeting neighbors with nods of respect and shared smiles that spoke louder than words. Their alliance, once born of necessity and fraught with tension, had blossomed into a partnership grounded in truth and tempered by compassion. The people saw in them not just leaders, but symbols of a future where old wounds could heal. One afternoon, beneath the sprawling branches of the young oak that Sigrid had planted months before, the village gathered. Children clustered at the roots, their laughter like bright birdsong weaving through the gentle breeze. Elders shared tales of the past winters, their voices a steady heartbeat echoing through time. Warriors sharpened blades, not for war, but for the work of building and protection. Sigrid stood before the crowd, the weight of the moment settling upon her like a familiar cloak. Her blue eyes scanned the faces, weathered, hopeful, alive. In her hands, she held an intricately carved wooden box, its surface etched with runes that spoke of protection and endurance. With deliberate reverence, she opened the box, revealing the brooch once belonging to her mother and the iron Thor's hammer necklace that had graced her father's neck. Beside them lay a small, worn rag doll, the last remnant of her sister Astrid, its faded blue dress still carrying the scent of long-ago summers. "These treasures," Sigrid began, voice steady but soft, "are more than memories. They are the threads that bind us, of family, of loss, of the promise that life endures even in the darkest winters." She lifted the brooch, its silver gleaming faintly in the sunlight filtering through the leaves. "My family's story is here, but so is the story of our village, of those who fell and those who rose after." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of history present in the air between words. Bjorn stepped forward, his voice deep and carrying the weariness of battle and the hope of peace. "We have chosen a different path, not one of vengeance or division, but of truth and healing. Let these tokens remind us that our strength lies not in the sword alone, but in the bonds we forge and the mercy we show." The elder Roxy nodded solemnly, stepping to place a hand beside Sigrid's on the box. "So it shall be written in the annals of our people." From the crowd, a young woman approached, a stranger wrapped in a thick cloak, her eyes a piercing gray that mirrored the sky above. She paused before Sigrid and Bjorn, the crowd parting like waves around her. "I am Freya of the northern fjords," she said, voice clear and resolute. "I have journeyed far seeking refuge and a new beginning. May I find a place among you?" Sigrid exchanged a look with Bjorn, the unspoken weight of acceptance hanging heavily between them. The valley had opened its arms wide enough to include those who sought not only shelter, but to join the fragile thread of this reborn community. "You are welcome," Sigrid said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had become her hallmark. "Here, we build not just homes, but lives rooted in truth and honor." Freya's lips curled into a tentative smile, relief shining through the exhaustion of travel. The villagers murmured their welcome, hands reaching out to guide her into the fold. Days later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with strokes of crimson and gold, a figure cloaked in travel-worn furs stood at the edge of the clearing. A man, his face lined with the gravity of journeys and decisions, adjusted the pack on his back. This was Eirik, the emissary of the Skjolder clan, whose initial arrival had heralded the fragile alliances that had stitched the valley back together. His gaze lingered on the village, now alive with the bustle of daily life, the laughter of children, the steady rhythm of work, the murmured prayers to the old gods. "I must continue my path," he said quietly to Sigrid during a fleeting moment beside the fire. "But know that the story of this place will travel far. Your courage and the strength of this community will be spoken of in many lands." Sigrid nodded, the ache of parting mingling with the gratitude of connection. "May your journey be safe, Eirik, and may the gods watch over you." He clasped her hand firmly, the bond forged in the crucible of winter's trials stretching beyond the valley's borders. As night deepened, the great hall of the village was filled with the low hum of voices and the flickering light of torches. Sigrid and Bjorn sat side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. Around them, the clan and their neighbors celebrated not just survival, but the choice to break cycles of violence and to embrace a future shaped by understanding. Songs filled the air, old stories retold with new meaning, and the quiet prayers to the gods blended with the warmth of kinship. Sigrid's gaze drifted upward to the rafters, where carved runes glowed faintly in the firelight, symbols of protection, strength, and rebirth. The journey that had begun with loss and cold had found its way to this fragile piece. Outside, the wind carried the scent of melting snow and fresh earth, the promise of new seasons to come. In the stillness, Sigrid whispered a silent prayer, not for vengeance, but for the wisdom to guide the days ahead, for the strength to lead with honor, for the courage to hold fast when storms returned. And as the fire's glow warmed the hall, the valley, she traced the smooth curve of the Thor's hammer necklace hanging at her neck, a silent reminder of the strength passed down from her father. The weight of responsibility had settled deep within her chest, a burden she neither sought nor shied away from. It was the legacy of those who had come before her, and the promise of those yet to come. Bjorn's gaze lingered on her, green-gray eyes reflecting the firelight with a softness that had once seemed impossible between them. "The gods test us in ways we cannot always understand," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "They ask us to choose between vengeance and mercy, between destruction and hope." Sigrid nodded, the memory of that bitter winter etched into every line of her being. The long nights alone in the cabin, the relentless snow, the ache of loss that had threatened to consume her. Yet it was in choosing mercy, against every instinct, that she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. "Mercy," she repeated softly, "is the hardest path. It demands more courage than the sword." The two sat in silence for a moment, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the faint rustle of fabric as the villagers stirred in their sleep. The valley outside was quiet now, but the memory of storms past, and those yet to come whispered in the wind. Sigrid's thoughts drifted to Astrid, the laughter that once filled the cabin, the small rag doll left behind like a beacon of innocence lost. She reached into her cloak and gently pulled the doll from its hidden pouch, the faded blue dress worn thin by time and memory. Holding it close, she felt the weight of the past and the fragile hope of the future entwined in that simple cloth. "Do you think the gods forgive us for what we have done? For the lives we have taken, the families broken?" Her voice cracked, carrying the sorrow she had buried beneath layers of resolve. Bjorn's expression darkened, the ghosts of his own choices weighing heavily. "I do not believe forgiveness is given freely. It must be earned, through truth, through justice, through the willingness to change." His words settled deep, echoing the lessons learned beneath the frozen sky. They were both marked by pain, by loss, yet bound together by the possibility of something new, something beyond the endless cycle of revenge. Outside, the first light of dawn began to pale the night, softening the edges of the valley with hues of pale gold and dusty rose. The snow, once a suffocating blanket, now melted into rivulets that whispered promises of renewal and growth. Sigrid rose slowly, the wolfskin cloak falling from her shoulders like a mantle laid aside after battle. She stepped toward the small altar at the back of the hall, where the brooch of her mother and the sword of her father rested. Her fingers trembled as she touched the cold silver, feeling the pulse of generations before her, the strength of those who had stood before storms, who had faced loss and found the will to endure. "We are not defined by the winters we survive," she whispered, voice steady and clear, "but by what we choose to become afterward." Bjorn stood beside her, his presence a quiet anchor in the shifting tides of fate. Together, they looked out the narrow window toward the rising sun, watching as the valley stretched awake beneath a sky that promised change. The clans would remember this winter, not just for its cruelty, but for the courage born from its shadows. The tale of a girl who survived alone, who chose compassion over hatred, would weave itself into the fabric of their shared history. It was a story not of easy victories, but of hard-won wisdom, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against the merciless cold. As the village stirred to life, Sigrid allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges. Old wounds healed slowly, and new threats lurked beyond the distant hills. Yet the fragile alliance forged in fire and frost was a beacon, a guide through the uncertain days. Her gaze fell once more upon the small rag doll, the symbol of innocence carried through the darkest night. It was a reminder that even in the harshest winters, there could be tenderness. That mercy, when wielded with strength, was the fiercest weapon of all. The gods had tested her, pressed her to the edge of despair and beyond. But in the crucible of solitude and forgiveness, something had been forged, a spirit unbroken, a heart willing to heal not only itself but those who had once been enemies. And so, beneath the spreading boughs of the young oak, the valley breathed once again, alive with hope, bound by truth, and ready to face whatever storms the future held. In the quiet that followed, Sigrid's voice rose in a soft prayer to the winds that whispered through the trees. May the gods grant us the wisdom to choose mercy over wrath, and the courage to build where others might destroy. The night held its breath, and somewhere deep in the forest, the howl of a lone wolf echoed, a sound both wild and free, a song of survival that would carry on long after the snow had melted. For those who listen closely, the story remains, a testament to the strength born from forgiveness, and the enduring power of the human heart to turn even the darkest winters into the dawn of a new beginning. If you have walked this journey with Sigrid and Bjorn, sharing in the shadows and the light, know that your presence honors their story. Subscribe to follow the unfolding tales of courage and conflict among the Vikings, where every choice carries the weight of honor, and every soul wrestles with the storms within. In the end, it was not the sword or the shield that shaped their fate, but the quiet defiance of mercy, the true legacy of a Viking's heart.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.